This week on Quadriga, Middle East upheaval. Israel's sidelined. Israel has seen its embassy in Cairo stormed by an angry mob and its ambassador expelled from Turkey. At loggerheads with the two neighbors it once got along with the best, Israel faces new pressure next week if Palestinians go through with a long-sought UN vote on statehood. The Arab Spring is changing politics in the Middle East. Your host, Melinda Crane.
Hello and welcome to Quadriga, the international talk show on DWTV. What do developments in the Middle East mean for Israel and for the region? And what, if anything, could still advance the cause of a negotiated peace? Those are some of the things we want to talk about today with three experts who've been following events in the region closely.
Margrethe Johansen is a senior research fellow at the Institute for Peace Research and Security Policy in Hamburg, and also teaches at the University of Hamburg. She writes frequently on the subject of conflict in the Middle East. Ilan Goren is a freelance Israeli journalist and writer. He previously served as European affairs correspondent for Israeli television and has also reported for the Washington Post and the German magazine Der Spiegel. Renee Aboul Ella is Palestinian and works in the field of immigration and integration. She studied journalism in Cairo and has worked as a correspondent for the Palestinian WAFA news agency.
Ilan Goren, one commentator described a possible UN vote on Palestinian statehood as a train wreck in the making. Would you agree with that?
Ooh. Well, I wouldn't know whether it's a train wreck, but it's definitely a roller coaster, that much for sure. I think what's interesting about this whole process going on in the UN is that the Israeli government, at least, and I think it's backed by most Israelis, has sort of realized somewhat belatedly that it has to do something. Something has to happen, because this train was definitely going on a certain track. The Israelis have been, I don't know if I could say passive, but definitely not very proactive in their approach to the whole issue. They were very defensive in their approach. And while you see the whole Middle East going into this kind of hyperactive mode, like switching gears, going into a much higher gear, but the Israelis were still in neutral for many, many months. This has been going on for a year now. It's not only the Palestinians, of course, being extremely active, and things are changing. And now the Israelis have suddenly sort of awoken, at least the Israeli government has sort of woke up to a new reality. Something is happening for sure. And my idea regarding it is that perhaps it would have been wise to think earlier of another way of doing it. Could it have been wiser to think of doing something together with the Palestinians, even going to the UN together? I mean, most Israelis would disagree with me, saying that, a unilateral move by the Palestinians is what they do. We shouldn't, we should just sort of be on the defense or something of the sort. But I think what would happen if the Israelis would offer some sort of a new bargain, a new deal, and go with the Palestinians to the UN and say, okay, you acknowledge us in some way, we acknowledge you in some way. That, of course, didn't happen, and now it's like a late trying to sort of repair things on a very late stage of this train going, as you've described it.
Ms. Aboul Ella, do you think the vote will go ahead? Can the train still be stopped in any way?
I don't think it will be stopped, but it will be in the General Assembly, and I don't know what does it mean to have a state from the General Assembly. I think psychologically it's very important, of course also politically, because they will argue even the State of Israel was proclaimed by a decision from the General Assembly. So the American veto will stop it be a real state in the UN agreed from the Council. But for the political movement in the region, it will be very important, and it will strengthen the trend to say two states solution. We have now a state.
Ms. Johansen, take us through the whole process, if you would, please. We've just heard a bit about the fact that the vote is unlikely to take place in the Security Council because the U.S. would veto it. What would be the implications of a Security Council vote with a veto as opposed to a General Assembly vote?
Well, a veto is a veto, so it requires the recognition by the Security Council for Palestine to become a full-fledged member. So if the General Assembly in a two-thirds or even three-quarters majority, and I think it will be at least a two-thirds majority, acknowledges and recognizes a Palestinian state, it will still not be a full member if the U.S. exercise their veto.
So what symbolic implications would a vote in the General Assembly have?
Well, it would actually accelerate the process of Palestine becoming a state. In the past, there were a number of states, Switzerland, I think, is the last one of those, that were not full-fledged members, but non-member states, so to speak, and they had responsibilities in a number of subcommittees and behaved, so to speak, very much like a state. And all these states have, in the end, become a state. So even if there is a veto by the US and the Security Council, the General Assembly moves, so to speak, will probably accelerate the move of Palestine towards a state status.
As we all know, there's feverish shuttle diplomacy going on right now at this moment, with diplomats from Europe and the U.S. going back and forth, trying to see if they can get a workaround here. I'd like to know from all of you whether you think this vote, if it goes ahead, really does set back the cause of peace. Let's start with Ilan Guran.
I think unilateral moves usually are not very useful in the Middle East. But then again, I mean, I think the Israeli qualms about a unilateral move have some sort of a justification to them. It's not a very useful thing to do. But having said that, as I've said, I think one has to realize that the Israeli position in the last, official Israeli position in the last year, was somewhat like a child closing its eyes, doing this and saying, if I can see you, you cannot see me. It doesn't work like this. And I mean, the Israelis have been so passive. Actually, they've been almost belligerent to the American government, especially to the person heading it, Mr. Obama. And now suddenly they sort of find themselves dependent upon a U.S. veto.
So you're saying it's kind of like a wake-up call, but is it going to wake up the Israelis to become more flexible or more intransigent, given this government that's in power?
It's a very tough question. I wouldn't know. I mean, I think it also depends on, whether we're going to see a fully fledged support for the Palestinian cause in the UN, also by the Europeans, to a certain extent, or not. If it's only going to be Israel and the United States against the rest of the world, of course, this is not feasible. Everyone knows it. Even Mr. Netanyahu knows it, and his coalition partners, right-wingers they may be. If it's a somewhat more balanced process, then I think the Israelis would be feeling, or the Israeli government would feel, that it still can sort of maintain a certain status quo. But a status quo is impossible these days in the Middle East, and that is something I think everyone should acknowledge. The whole region is changing. We cannot just, sit and...
Ms. Abdullela, American congressmen have been saying, hey, we're going to cut off all help for the Palestinians if this thing goes ahead. Would that set back the Palestinians' situation?
I don't think so, because they will realize at the end there must be a solution. It cannot go on the same way as it went until now. And this is only a step to stir the cup, It's not the solution, but it shows...
Do you think it's a productive stirring?
I think so, yes. Because we need to get ahead, to move in any other direction than the one we are going on until now, since Oslo. And I think that Israel lost a very big chance when they didn't go on with Oslo and get the peace agreement, really. And also when they didn't accept the Arabic initiative, when all the Arabic government for the first time said we will acknowledge Israel if they will acknowledge the Palestinian state, it was for the Arabic world a historic movement. Nobody could expect it, but it happened, and Israel didn't realize how important it was. So now it's the time that Netanyahu and the others wake up and realize it's not going to be the same.
Ms. Johansson, Will this wake-up call produce something constructive for the region?
Well, I think the Palestinians hardly had a choice. Insofar, I would say the wake-up call was necessary. And everybody knows that whether there is a Palestinian state recognized in the UN, whether it's a full member state or a half member state or whatever, we still need negotiations because nothing is settled. I mean, the border thing, the Jerusalem thing, the refugee thing, security, nothing is settled. After 2 years ago, the Palestinian Prime Minister said he was going to build up the institutions of a state, a Palestinian state. And the whole world applauded. The US applauded, the European Union applauded, everybody applauded, Israel applauded. And now after 2 years, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund and the United Nations, they all declared that this PA, this Palestinian Authority, this semi-state, has all the institutions now they need for a state status, so to speak. And all of a sudden, after these 2 years, and he said it's going to be 2 years, and now is the time. And as everybody knows, the negotiations are stuck, and to my mind, they are mainly stuck because of the settlement policy of the present Israeli government. So what could Mahmoud Abbas do? So I believe after a period of breathtaking and things might settle, and it might very well be that negotiations start again, but the other alternative is let's say a third intifada, not of the kind of the second one, the militarized one, but a civilian, with civil means, a bit after the model of what happened in Tunisia and maybe in Egypt. This is an alternative, and it is very dangerous because this might escalate.
It actually has sort of started to a certain extent. One has to acknowledge things going on along the security fence and the Syrian
example. And very much depends on how Israel, as always, very much depends on how Israel reacts. It might remain still. It might remain non-violent. It could also escalate. Nobody knows.
Tzipi Livni said this week in Parliament in Israel that the Netanyahu government has maneuvered Israel into a disastrous position and that the country finds itself now completely isolated thanks to this government. You mentioned earlier the fact that the vote could be a wake-up call, that perhaps something could come of it. Do you really think the Netanyahu government is likely to move in a positive way?
Well, first of all, it depends on how you define positive. Most Israelis, you have to acknowledge that fact. Most Israelis, and it is a democracy after all, and we do have, we vote. But most Israelis, 65% of Israelis, and maybe 75% of the Jewish population of Israel, does not think that Israel should move of its current position. That much we have to acknowledge. But I think saying that the current situation is disastrous is a bit too much. I think it's true that Israel is isolated. I think anyone in his right mind would not say differently, maybe apart from the Israeli government. But Israel is isolated to a certain extent. And I think what needs to be done is some sort of a relaunch of a negotiation process. This cannot last forever. That much is true. Whether it would be successful or not, it's very hard. I think it's also important to remember, although I sort of consider myself to be from the different side of the political map than Mr. Netanyahu and his colleagues, I think we cannot blame everything on Israel. I think we cannot say that the Israeli government should initiate all the social-political processes in the region all by itself. Having said that, I think the onus is on Israel now for sure. The Palestinians have made their move, whether it be successful or not, and now the Israelis have to sort of, the chess game is, the ball is in Israel court, no doubt about that.
Let's take a brief look at some of the events in the past year that have produced Israel's isolation, starting with Turkey, a country with which Israel formerly had good relations.
In May 2010, an Israeli commando boarded the Mavi Marmara, a Turkish ship carrying aid for the Palestinians and determined to break the Gaza blockade. 9 Turkish citizens died in the crossfire. Prime Minister Erdogan called the raid a cause of war and demanded Israel apologize. As no apology came, Erdogan's rhetoric has turned more belligerent. He's threatened to send Turkish warships more frequently to the eastern Mediterranean. And on this week's tour through the Middle East, has urged isolation of Israel, saying it will pay a price for ignoring international law and abusing the human dignity of the Palestinians.
Ms. Abu Ella, the Prime Minister Erdogan's trip through the Middle East was looking pretty triumphant this weekend. He was certainly speaking in a very vocal way in support of the Palestinians and their cause. Is this grandstanding? Is it mostly also just symbolic, or do you think that it will have real implications for Palestinians?
Real implications is too much. I think this is something for Turkey, and he is working for his country, and he wants to reach the Arab world because he was blocked in Europe. His first move was towards Europe, and it was blocked. So Turkey wants to take its place on the world map, on the political world map. So the second tour is the Arab world. To reach the Arab people on the street, Palestine is the key. So he used the correct key to reach the people. That's why he was very triumphant. But actually he was working, of course, for his country to see the future of Turkey in the region and which role Turkey will play in the region. And
but I'd like to differ. I don't think it's in Turkey's interest to sort of have its prime minister roam the Middle East in this kind of ecstatic mood, threatening to send warships to the eastern Mediterranean. And I mean the tone was really belligerent, to be completely honest. It wasn't a statesman tone. It was almost Ottoman to a certain extent. I don't think it's in Turkey's interest or in anyone's interest to have this war of words.
Perhaps not in Israel's interest either. Couldn't Israel have obviated?
Interest as well.
Couldn't Israel have obviated this entire tour by simply issuing an apology?
It would have been helpful. That much is true. But you have to remember that Mr. Erdogan himself has just annulled the Palmer report, the UN reports claiming that the events around the Mavi Marmara, around the flotilla, were actually legal, according to international law. I think, personally, that Israel should have apologized in some way or another. It would have been helpful. People have died, and that is something, I mean, even if you don't want to apologize for it, at least you can be sort of humane about it. At least you could sort of say, well, we're sorry for the loss of lives. That would have been helpful. But then again, I think Mr. Erdogan has taken a certain position, and wouldn't really matter, well, not in the grand scheme of things, if Israel have been more cooperative or less. It could have been tactically helpful, but I think, generally speaking, Turkey has taken a dangerous turn, in my view, and it doesn't help.
Ms. Johansson, what do you make of Turkey's new role, and how will it affect the constellation and the tensions between Israel and the Palestinians?
Well, I would say that actually he was acting as a political leader of Turkey. It was the Turkish. I would agree. It was Turkish interest. Maybe you might not like the tone. You might not like the attitude. But it was still I would say, a pragmatic move. He's a charismatic leader, but he's a pragmatist at the same time. And after Europe had more or less shut the door to Turkey's accession to the European Union, and Turkey being an economic power with growth rates, amazing growth rates, fifth in the world or something, he was asserting himself as somebody who has the choice. He has the choice looking westward, he has the choice looking eastward, or southward, and he was playing the card right now, the card of being the leader of a country whose population is Muslim, and he was traveling in countries whose population were Muslim, and he was playing this card. So I would say that it has not so much to do with the Palestinians. It has much more to do with Turkey.
With Turkey.
Well, it seems to me like you're actually saying that being belligerent or being hostile, it's not just the tone. Saying we're ready to send our ships to the Eastern Mediterranean, that's pretty severe.
I didn't want to play it down. I was just saying, I wanted to say that it's not in his focus. It's not so much the Palestinian issue. Palestine here is an instrument.
Yeah, that much is true.
It is the key to the people in
it's a tragedy.
in the Arab world.
Everyone uses it as an instrument.
And he was very intelligent when he said to the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and the people, you have to have a secular state. So he is selling himself and Turkey as a modern state, and he wants to be a powerful modern state
with a modern army
in the region. And so because he knows if he will come like an Ottoman, as you said, he didn't come like one, because then he will be rejected in the Arab world.
And I would like to add something. Even if he was using this incident, the Gaza flotilla, as an instrument, I'm not saying that this is not an issue. I mean, the blockade. So it's still more or less a blockade. Is an issue by itself. I mean, it's a very important issue. I was only trying to say that to him it matters, and he knows, of course, it matters to the population of all Arab countries. I mean, he was not just playing to their minds; he was playing to their hearts.
Ilan Guren, Israel is, of course, facing tensions not just with Turkey, but also with Egypt, which was also its other closest connection in the region.
And the list goes on, yeah.
Does all of this indicate that the Arab Spring is actually making Israel less secure? And is Israel's rigidity in the face of the developments that have gone along with the Arab Spring justifiable, or is it making the situation worse?
I think there's a point to what you're saying. It seems to me like the first commandment for Benjamin Netanyahu and his government is, thou shalt not be proactive. Just, stay back. And as I've said, many Israelis, I think most Israelis support that. I think he's following an example set by Yitzhak Shamir, Prime Minister in Israel 20 years ago. A person who sort of said, that's exactly what we should do. We should be strong, we should stay back, whatever. And eventually Shamir found himself facing a severe economic crisis because of the lack of American collaterals, and he was dragged into a peace process in Madrid. And I think Mr. Netanyahu might find himself eventually in the same corner. He cannot just use, a Republican stronghold in Congress to sort of steer his whole tactic in the international sphere. And I think that's mainly what he was doing in the last year, trying to exert certain pressure on Mr. Obama, not doing much in terms of, the processes going around him in the region. The Arab Spring would happen whether Israel likes it or not. Mr. Netanyahu shouldn't be blamed for, not changing the course of history. He cannot change the course of history, but he could have reacted differently. That much is true.
Ms. Abu Ella, Ms. Johansson, and because we don't have a lot of time, I'm going to throw one question into the mix that maybe you can include in your answers. What, if anything, could get a peace process back on track?
I think this is the only solution. It has to go back on track, and it has to come to an end. Not only go back on track and keep on going, but it has to come to an end, which is the two states solution. I just wanted to say something. Egypt was not the friend of Israel. Mubarak was the friend of Israel.
That much is true.
And Israel didn't realize that you don't have peace treaties with friends. You have peace treaties with enemies, and then you work politically on it until you become friends. After the treaty, there was no work on it. And that's why this is the situation we have today. They didn't lose Egypt, they lost Mubarak.
What kind of work did you expect the Israelis?
Okay, I'm sorry, but I'm just going to move on to Ms. Johansson, because,
Israel should, in the long term, be interested in having democratic neighbors. It is a democratic peace means that in the long term, you are more secure if your neighbors are democratic states.
And the short term?
But the transition towards democracy is sometimes troubled waters, and the hostility of the Egyptian population is mainly due to the Palestine conflict. It is not a matter of between Egypt and Israel.
Breaking into the Israeli embassy and almost lynching everyone there.
I'm not justifying, Mr. Gorin, I'm not justifying
it. Wasn't far from that.
I'm not justifying it. I'm just trying to explain the difference between the peace treaty that was a peace treaty between governments and the relationship between the Egyptian population and the Arab population in general and Israel.
Actually, the people are doing much better than the governments. I've heard the Egyptian Prime Minister saying yesterday that the peace treaty is not holy. It is holy for Israelis.
I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it right there, but we will have ample time to discuss this topic in future. Thank you so much for being with us today, and thanks to all of you for tuning in.